Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and today I'm delighted to have as my guest Dr. Martin Moran, whose parents were born in Ireland. He grew up in the Bronx, moved to Arizona. No, we were just talking about that, Dr. Moran. Welcome to the Atlanta Fulton Public Library and the Fulton County Government Center.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin Moran is an MD who practiced pediatrics for 30 years in Marietta.
Sandy Springs.
Sandy Springs, I'm sorry. You were the author of the book that we're about to talk about. It's called Atlanta's Living Legacy, A History of Grady Memorial Hospital and Its People. By way of introduction, you were a history major in college.
Yes.
And yet you went on to the University of Tennessee College of Medicine and obtained your medical degree in 1963. You've always had an interest in history. I see a book in front of me called The Tincture of Time, the story of 150 years of medicine in Atlanta, written by yourself. You are on the board of the Atlanta Medical History Society, and you walked into my office about a month ago and you said, I've written a book about Grady Hospital. And the first thing I said to you was, oh, you mean the Gradys. I want to give you the bait and take it, okay? Sure. I used to hang around a criminal defense attorney. She and I were friends, and she would tell me about these old clients that would come into her office and talk about going to the Gradys. And we thought it was a solecism. It's Grady Hospital. Grady's, someone's adding an S to it. It was the Gradys.
Yes.
You want to take off on that one?
Well, the hospital, when the hospital was first built, it initially was designed to be a white hospital, although it was integrated in the sense that there were black wards and white wards. The idea behind it was to build this hospital, then remove the African American citizens to the hospital that they were going to build called the Franklin Hospital.
Okay.
That never took place. So you had wards for black males, black females, white males, and white females. And then what happened was that hospital grew tired, decrepit, so they built a new hospital, and then the original medical school built in Atlanta in 1857 was torn down in 1906. A new building was put up, the Atlanta College of Physicians and Surgeons, and then that was turned over as a black hospital or colored hospital. And so the hospital that was built in 1912 was a white hospital. The original hospital, built in 1892, the building is still there, although the wards are gone. The wards behind it are gone.
The building is still there?
The building is still there. It has that little bell tower. It's a red building. It's right across the street from Hugh Spalding.
Yeah. Let's start with 1892. Dr. Moran, there's so much in this book. It literally is an encyclopedia and source book about Grady Hospital. You cannot understand the city of Atlanta, nor medicine in America, without understanding Grady Hospital. In 1892, see if I have this right, Atlanta was a city filled with self-boosters, and we know about this. Henry Grady was talking about the New South and stuff like that, and a bunch of very important people, and I'll be very quickly, because this is your book, a bunch of people said, you know, we need a hospital for poor people. Not so much of Christian charity, although that had a lot to do with it, but if a blacksmith or a bull rider or a cotton picker gets injured, they're not working. We need a place to take care of them. Is that really the beginning of Grady Hospital?
Yes. Grady never really spoke out for a hospital for the poor. What he did, though, he went to Spelman Seminary.
We're talking about Henry Grady.
Henry Grady.
Yeah.
And he noticed, he saw young African-American nursing students put on a great performance. And so he decided, he got involved. He praised them in his newspaper. Unfortunately, he gets pneumonia in 1889, and he dies December 23rd, 1889. His friends met a couple of days later, and actually the next day, and decided to do something in his memory, which is that bronze statue that sits on Marietta Street. But there was a man by the name of Mr. Moore who wrote a letter to the Constitution and said Henry Grady was more than a statue. He would give $5,000 to the building of a hospital for the poor and leave $5,000 in his will. And so the mayor, John Glenn, was approached,
Yeah.
and he took it from there, and he got some interested citizens, and it took off. It took off slowly.
Oh, yeah.
It took
yeah.
off slowly.
The whole, and what I'm learning from the book too, is that the whole concept of hospitals is relatively new in Western civilization, we might say. Hospitals were designed primarily for people who couldn't afford doctors to come into their own houses. I mean, I'm of that generation, Dr. Moran.
Almshouses, there were almshouses, there were people who were abandoned,
Yeah.
homeless, terminally ill.
My parents used to say, if you keep up this, Jimmy, you'll end up in the poorhouse.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's what they were for.
Okay.
I think the Civil War changed a
Okay.
lot of that. All
Yeah.
of a sudden,
Yeah.
hospitals became clean.
Yeah.
You know, they had ambulances. You know, medicine changed a
Yeah.
little bit. And then, you know, when you started having Lister and Pasteur and people
Yeah.
like that coming up with their discoveries, hospitals became a place to go. And then hospitals could afford equipment. I mean, no private physician could afford an X-ray machine at that time.
We're going to do 120 years of Grady Hospital in 30 minutes. So, ladies and gentlemen, get ready. It started out as a charity hospital, primarily for poor people. Tell me again when, if you go up to anybody in Atlanta right now, people will tell you, oh, Grady Hospital used to be a hospital for poor African-American people, and now it's got a great trauma unit. If you need an emergency medical service, go to Grady. How do you describe Grady's evolving in
Well, Grady,
10 or 20 sentences?
well, Grady for years was 50% white and 50%
Okay,
black.
it was designed that way.
It was designed that way.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's who the people were in the city. What happened was a civil rights movement, and a lot of whites got out of the cities and moved to the
That's right,
suburbs.
that's right.
So all of a sudden, you go from a 50% white patient load down to a 10%. So it became sort of a black institute, but for black citizens.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I'm still thinking about the person who goes up to you and says, Dr. Moran, I'm about to read your book on Grady Hospital. Have the finances of Grady Hospital always been as contentious as it appears to be?
Yes.
How so? How so?
Well, it was difficult to raise the money in the first place. People would say, oh, I pay taxes.
Yeah.
Now why should I donate to Grady Hospital? Because the original start of the hospital was contributions. Joseph Hirsch, an immigrant, went out and helped raise money. Now the city gave $30,000 to build a hospital, and then there was an institution called the Benevolent Home, and that closed down. It was a failure. They got $20,000 from that property. But you had to go out and raise money. And people were saying, I pay taxes. Why now am I being asked to contribute to a hospital that I'll never use?
But you end the book, we're going way ahead of ourselves, with one of my favorite characters in Atlanta history, Manuel Malouf, saying that if they ever turn the lights off in Atlanta, the last light they should turn off are the lights in Grady Hospital. How has it become so important to the well-being of Atlanta?
Well, it trains many of the physicians,
we
first
forget
of all.
that. We
Yes.
forget that.
25% of the physicians in the state of Georgia are trained at Grady Hospital. Not fully trained, perhaps, but internships
yeah.
or residencies, or they went to Emory and they trained partially. So from just that point alone, it's the Poison Control Center. I mean, if you wake up and you're in Valdosta, Georgia, and you find that your child just drank 50-some tablets, who do you call? You call the Poison Control Center.
Right.
That's at Grady Hospital. If you get significant burns in this community, you go to Grady. If you're in a major auto accident, you go to Grady. If there's a plane crash at Jackson Hartsfield, I guarantee it, they're going to take the survivors to Grady Hospital. They're prepared, they're enthusiastic, and they're trained.
I'm curious about, you were practicing pediatric physician for over 30 years in Sandy Springs. Professionally, what was your feeling about Grady? Was it always that's where poor people go, or even when you were practicing? What did you discover in this book about Grady that you might not have known during your career?
During my career, I discovered that the physicians that came out of there to practice in my section of town were well trained.
Okay.
That's the first thing. That if you had a severe burn, that's where you went. God forbid if you were shot, that's where you went. any kind of severe trauma. You know, I lived here in Atlanta when that plane crashed at New Hope Church, and they took the survivors.
That's right.
They took the survivors to Grady Hospital. They didn't stop at Piedmont or Baptist or Crawford Long. They went to Grady because the burn unit was there, and they're well trained. And
The Weinkauf fire, the worst.
119 people died in the Weinkauf fire.
Right.
You know?
There's so much in it. My head is swimming with facts, but I'm going to look at my notes right now. I'd like to talk about the evolution of Grady, how it became a small charity hospital, and now it's one of the great hospitals in America, if not the world. How did let's focus on one aspect. In 1928, Albert Steiner, an immigrant to Atlanta, made a lot of money, donated a lot of money to Grady, and in the course of a couple of years, by 1930, according to this book, Grady had the largest cancer hospital on earth.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, what he did was
Run by the grandfather of a good friend of mine, Rupert Fike's grandfather, Dr. R.H.
Reuben
Fike.
Fike.
Unbelievable.
Steiner's wife died
Yeah.
of cancer. His child dies, and he gets cancer, and he dies. He leaves an estate worth over $600,000. Now, he's given gifts.
This is the 1920s.
Yeah,
This is like-
1919.
Wow, wow.
He gives money to Scottish Rite,
Yeah.
$100,000, and then he backs it with another gift. But his final will left over $600,000 to be used to help take care of the poor. And he left some trustees in charge of the money. They met with people at Grady, and they decided what this city needed was a cancer hospital. There wasn't one. Now, cancer hospitals are relatively new. They were about 40 years old, starting up in New York. But so he left the money, and they built the Steiner Clinic. Radium, which was being used now, was $124,000 a gram. They had 70 grams of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's mind-boggling to me. They were the largest cancer hospital in the world at one time.
As a physician, how many? You don't address it as much as maybe I missed it, but the idea of a charity hospital. Do most big cities have charity hospitals? Does Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco have a similar Grady?
Cook is in Chicago,
okay,
Bellevue in
okay.
New York, what used to be called John Gaston in Memphis, and now it's called the Med. But some of them have had hard times. You know, I think they've closed down in Philadelphia, or they've been privatized. So they were going to privatize, Grady for a while.
Yeah.
There was a move to do that, but it worked out. People grabbed a hold of the problem, and
The book is filled with amazing anecdotes, and it's not one of my favorites, it's one of the most depressing facts in the book is that you have, at one point you say that Grady was the Noah's Ark of medical practice because you had two of everything, one for blacks and one for whites. Up until relatively recently, up until the 1960s, if I recall, reading the book, if you were an African-American patient in the black ward of Grady, you were treated by white physicians. Black physicians could not practice medicine in Grady?
Yes.
Explain that.
well, I didn't grow up with Jim Crow.
No, I know that. I know that.
So, but that's the way it was. It's just the way it was.
Yeah, yeah.
Emory was not integrated until Hamilton Holmes came along.
See, we forget that, don't I forget that.
Yeah, I mean, so it was two of everything, like you said, two of everything. The building was an H,
Yeah.
and so they had two of everything. And it made medicine more expensive. I mean, people were spending money duplicating equipment. You got an X-ray machine there, you got an X-ray machine. I mean, it didn't make much sense. But finally, on June 1st, 1965, Bill Pinkston, the administrator of the Grady, everybody will be categorized by their disease and not their race.
Yeah, Grady, if I'm reading this book correctly, Dr. Moran, Grady wasn't just a hospital for the poor, a charity hospital. It was also at the cutting edge of medicine in America. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Hookworm.
I remember reading about that in high school. The poor Southerners infested with hookworms, and
Poor blacks and poor whites were considered
Yeah.
lazy by the upper class. Well, they had malaria, or they had pellagra, or they had hookworm. In 1899, a military physician, Ashford Bailey, goes to Puerto Rico. The Spanish-American War is over. And the first question he asks when he gets there is, why do people die here? It's such kind of a neat place. And they all said the same thing, anemia. And so he checked into it, and sure enough, the Puerto Rican citizens were infested with hookworm. In 1901, in Atlanta, Joel Hurt had some hound dogs. They're sick. He takes them to various vets, and the vets say, we don't know what's wrong with them. So he takes them to Claude Smith, the pathologist at Grady, and what do you think? And his answer was, I don't know, but bring them back when they're dead. And so he does. He does an autopsy on the dogs, and he finds hookworm in the dogs. Now, he made a mistake in the sense that hookworm in a dog is not the same as a hookworm in a human being. The next thing he does is he goes to the Chattahoochee Brick Company, which is owned by James English, and he checks the stools of 20 prisoners, and he finds hookworm in 2 of them. He does an autopsy on a man that just dies at the city jail, and he finds hookworm in him. He makes his presentation to the American Medical Association in Saratoga, New York. From after that, he pushed the idea that hookworm is endemic in this area. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission was formed in 1909, funded with $1 million from Rockefeller, and they treated 75,000 men, women, and children in Georgia from 1910 to 1915. Mind-boggling.
It is. It is. You mentioned like Captain James English, and you mentioned in the book too that in those days, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, medical experimentation on people was fairly common.
Yes.
You say it so yes. That's shocking to me, but it happened all the time, right?
It happened all the time.
Yeah.
You know, the first real evidence that I can find of ethics in regards to patient permission was Walter Reed. When he was doing his yellow...
That's Spanish-American War in like 1896.
Yes,
yeah.
when 1898. When he was doing his experiments on the cause of yellow fever, he got permission from the volunteers that may happen to you. You may die. And they signed the statement. So he didn't just do it on soldiers. He had them read the document and sign it, got permission to experiment.
You write about this in the book, Dr. Moran, but why is it that nowadays, it's 2012, going on 2013, if you say to someone, what do you think about Grady Hospital? 9 times out of 10 you'll hear, not a great place to go for a chronic ailment, but if you get a gunshot, if someone stabs you, if you're in an automobile accident, get to the Grady ER as quickly as possible. How did that evolve? Why is Grady so famous for its trauma center and ER?
Well, there's a lot of trauma. I mean,
I love your answers.
Well, there was a large volume of it on Friday nights and Saturday nights. Ingestion of alcohol, and there was a lot of violence.
You have a little chapter on the Grady rooters. Like every Friday night, there'd be a bunch of people who would come downtown and wait for the ambulances to show up and just say, who got shot tonight?
Yeah, that kind of thing. And then when the person would leave, bandaged or in a sling or whatever,
there'd be applause.
Applauding. It was their entertainment. But they were imbibing alcohol at the same time. It was entertainment for them. You know, free television perhaps.
But that's why, so the great ER and trauma centers grew out of just the need for it. No one else was doing it.
Absolutely. You have to have a great trauma center, you have to have in-house doctors. You cannot have a person like me at home at 2 o'clock in the morning sound asleep and have a severe emergency. The doctor taking care of that particular patient needs to be there, and they are there at Grady.
Now, have you ever worked at Grady?
No.
What about those Green Beret doctors that you were...
Well, I never...
Good.
I trained Green Beret doctors in 1968, 69 at Fort McPherson. They would come for 3 months. I would teach them some pediatrics. Somebody in ear, nose, and throat would teach them ear, nose, and throat.
Yeah.
Somebody took them to surgery. But we didn't have enough trauma. So I just got permission. It was under the table, I guess they would say these days. Got permission for them to go down there. And they would spend Saturday nights, and they loved it. And they learned a great deal. I have to ask you this question for the people out there who were saying, every time we read about Grady in the newspaper, we don't know how to fund it. But after reading your book, Atlantis Living Legacy, from 1892 to the present, 120 years, no one has known
the best viable way to pay for Grady. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
How?
I mean,
Good.
say you have a family and you have 3 kids and you're paying for private insurance, either to your company or you pay part of it
Yeah.
or you pay the whole thing. And then on your property tax bill several years back, there was the Grady section. And that amounted to 25 to 30% of my total property taxes was going to Grady Hospital. You know, if you're marginally making it financially to be spending $3,000 or $4,000 on your own insurance and then paying and your property taxes are $5,000 and now you're paying another $1,500, it was difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now they took that off, so now the only thing, there's no line items like that. There may be for the school, but Grady is no longer a line item.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but reading this book sometimes it can be so fascinating. It's not only just the history of Grady, it's also the history of medicine in America. Now, you went to a very good medical school. In 1892, doctors were not considered great. There was not the social class that doctors enjoy now was not present in 1892.
Yes.
And that had to do with bear me out for a second, that had to do with the differing levels of certification in the United States. One state might not certify you as a doctor. You could call yourself a doctor. Am I saying that the right way?
Yes. What happened was they had...
Bear me out. Bail me out.
You had preceptorship. So if I decided I wanted to become a physician, I would go hang out in a doctor's office. My uncle, perhaps, or a neighbor or a friend for 6 to 9 months. Yeah, I like this. And then I would go to school. School at that time was sometimes 9 months. The academic requirements to get into medical school were minimal. I mean, we had one school, you had to finish the 8th grade.
That's right. That's right.
Now, they flunked a lot of people out. We had 4 medical schools in Atlanta. And then the Flexner report that came out in 1910 castigated them. I mean, they were awful. Well, some of them were worse than others, but they were not very, very good schools. They were not the Hopkins of the world, or the Harvards. So the Flexner report forced the dynamic of the medical schools to either disappear or to merge. And they merged in 1913, and then in 1915. The feeling was a medical school should be associated with a university, primarily for the basic sciences, the chemistries and the bacteriology and that kind of thing. So in 1915, 2 schools here, united in 1913, and then in 1915, became Emory University, School of Medicine.
The history of Grady also is the history of Atlanta. I've said that at least 3 or 4 times during the course of this interview. Grady has brought together immigrant philanthropists, Emory, Coca-Cola, and the Civil Rights Movement, all in almost one fell swoop.
Yes.
Was that surprising to you during your research? Were you aware of this before the research?
No.
I mean, it's a history of Atlanta.
Yeah, no, I was not. I mean, I'm like a newborn when it came to starting this project.
Yeah.
You know, the hospital, I used to harass my kids. I would drive down to the Braves game and I would say, that's the most important building in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And then we go to the Braves game. I did that for a few years.
Yeah.
And then finally one of my kids said, Dad, is that the most important building in Atlanta? I mean, they were kidding me. So I really didn't know much about it. But once I started, it became fascinating to me. I mean, you're like the immigrants. Jacob Elsis comes over here penniless, and he's 15 years of age, he's penniless. Becomes a millionaire. Joseph Hirsch comes over with nothing. Becomes very, very wealthy, and was head of the board of trustees for 20 years. He was Mr. Grady Hospital. I mean, Elsis gave a lot of money to the clinics, helped buy some of the property that the building is on. I mean, very generous people. And the Steiner, who was also Jewish, an immigrant, built the Steiner Clinic. Well, he didn't do it, but his estate did, and became the largest cancer hospital in the world.
And thinking of Mr. Anonymous, Robert Woodruff, who was so important to Grady.
Yes.
I'm kind of I'm hemming and hawing here, Dr. Moran, because there's so much in this book. How important is Grady? I mean, we should really, as citizens of the state of Georgia and Atlanta, Fulton County, we should know more about Grady. Because I think after reading this, I'm going to let you talk for a second. After reading this book, there's no question in my mind that we should support whatever it costs, Grady Hospital. Do you feel that way too?
Yes. I personally think it's...
That's went out on a limb.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
I personally think it's the most important building in Georgia
Yeah.
for Georgians. Now, I think the CDC is probably the most important building in Georgia for the rest of the world. But for Georgians, Grady Hospital, I mean, 25% of the physicians practicing in rural Georgia
Yeah.
have trained in that institution. That's incredible. And now with Morehouse being part of Grady Hospital, it's even more important.
It is. It is. We haven't even reached the civil rights movement in our talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm kind of in awe of this author and his subject, Grady Hospital. Go out and get a copy of Atlanta's Living Legacy, A History of Grady Memorial Hospital and Its People, written by Dr. Martin Moran, M.D. It's a history of Grady Hospital, and in turn it's a history of where we live here in Atlanta. Remarkable achievement. Thank you, Dr. Moran.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussions only. No endorsements by the Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed.